must be some long introduction.
I think it's supposed to be about 2 minutes. I'm not sure if we can be heard right now.
Should we check by saying something inappropriate?
I think we've got about a minute left to get it in. I nominate you to begin.
The Mysuru Literary Forum Charitable Trust and the literary community of Mysuru Book Clubs welcomes you to the 4th Mysuru Literature Festival and the first virtual festival. Adventure. Here's an adventure. What awaits? Beyond this closed, mysterious gates? Whom shall I meet? Where shall I go? Beyond the lovely land I know. Above the sky, across the sea? What shall I learn and feel and be? Open strange doors to good or ill. I hold my breath a moment still. Before the magic of your look, what shall you do to me, O book? And now, the virtual sessions of Mysuru Literature Festival. What shall we learn and feel and be? What shall you do to us, O author? What doors will you open? What magic will you bring? We welcome the writers from across the world who made this happen. Authors who are able to join us in the digital space and share their books and their writing with us. And for the next hour, let us enter behind closed mysterious gates, travel above the sky and across the sea to meet them in this virtual space. Before we start, a few guidelines for our attendees. Enter your question in the Q&A section. Our moderators will send them to the speakers. Please post your questions relevant to the panel discussions. Please enter the name of the city you are from. We are interested in knowing where our audience is from. Sit back and enjoy the session.
Good evening. My name is Ganeshananthan, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this, which I believe is the first session of the Literary Festival. Welcome, thank you to all of the virtual attendees. And also welcome to my co-panelists. And thank you so much to the organizers of the festival for inviting us to join them today. I'm gonna make this introduction very brief, as you have just seen cover images of today's panelists, each of whom will also introduce the next person. So just a brief note about the format for today. As you will have seen from the title of the panel, today we're going to be discussing the openings of some of our works, and each of us will be discussing and asking questions of one other person. So we'll do this in a sort of round robin format, taking about 12 to 15 minutes a piece for that, after which we'll have time for question and answer. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this off to Soniah, who I think is going to be speaking to Preeta.
Hi, everyone. To echo what Sugi was saying, thank you so much for having us. And it's a delight to be opening the Mysuru Festival with a session on openings. I will be asking Rita Samrasin questions about her wonderful novel, Evening is the Whole Day. And I will read her bio from the book. Rita Samrasin was born and raised in Malaysia, but moved to the United States during high school. She recently received her MFA from the University of Michigan, where an early version of this book received the Hopwood Novel Award. She has also won the Asian American Writers Workshop Short Story Award. She currently lives in France. Rita, is there anything you'd like to add to that bio?
No, obviously it's quite old now, so I haven't so recently received my MFA, but other than that, it's accurate. Yeah.
It's accurate. Okay. All right. So I don't know if we're going to be able to see our if the excerpts are going up. So
I am doing that right now.
Oh, okay. All right. I was going to explain that what we are going to do is take the beginnings of our novels, and we're going to ask questions, craft-related questions, mostly about how they're formed, why they were written this way, and questions of that nature. So Preeta's novel opens up with chapter headings. Her first chapter does, and they're chapter headings for the rest of the in the rest of the novel also. And she gives a date. So my first question actually is about the chapter headings, which was, why did you choose to give them? I mean, sometimes, or at least when I'm writing, I tend to avoid them. I used to put chapter headings in when I first started writing, and then I just decided to avoid them because I figured it gave away some of the suspense of what was coming up in the novel, in the chapters. So what made you decide to keep them in? And how do you think that helps with the whole question of suspense and what to expect? Does it, I'm assuming you think it adds to, therefore you kept it.
Well, actually, so part of the reason I chose to put them in is that I was trying to sort of evoke, some of my influences, which are, 18th and 19th century English novels. So sort of the whole in which blah, blah, blah happens, but except I've localized it a little bit or changed the feeling of it a little bit. But also, since you mentioned suspense, that wasn't really a big, in the novel, I sort of give away the biggest incident, right at the beginning. And so it's sort of the chapter heading giving away some of what's happened is also deliberate. Like, I want to give away what's happened because I want this novel is more about why the things happened as they did rather than what happened. So I didn't mind. It was a deliberate decision to undercut that suspense a little bit and to put some of the information, to put some of the information right in the title.
Right. Okay. So you mentioned that this is less about what happened per se and more about the why of what had happened, which tells me that it is more of a perhaps character-based novel, and the intricacies of why motive and why characters and humans do what they do. So how do you feel that the chapter headings help in that regard, like giving chapter headings like this? I mean, the chapter that we see up on screen, it's the ignominious departure of Chelam, servant, daughter of Muniandi. I hope I said that was right. And it is about the departure very much so, and we get the name. And so what do you think in a novel of this type, which is more concerned with the why of what is happening, these are helpful? Like, would you suggest that writers do something like this? What does it bring to the table?
Well, I can't be prescriptive about it. I don't suggest anything to other writers. I think the decision, has to be made by each writer according to the demands of their novel. But in this case, I think, I did make, there's an adjective in it, the ignominious departure, so that already tells you, signals that something, I guess it distances the narrator from what's happening and gives you an idea of what the narrator thinks of what's happening, doesn't necessarily agree, there's no approval there. And then I think what the title does here is to underline some of the class and unspoken caste concerns of the novel, like Chelam's servant. She doesn't, her name is, sort of inextricable from her status. She's not just Chelam, she's Chelam's servant. Let's underline that she's a servant. And then the daughter of Muniandi, which I think, I'm not sure, it's interesting, this is the first time anyone's asked me this question, but I'm not sure non-Malaysian readers would have necessarily picked up on this, but daughter of is how Malaysian Indians' names are registered officially. Like, I'm actually Preeta, daughter of Samarasan. And so there's a certain, how do I put this? There's a certain, let's say that middle and upper class Indians tend to drop that, and we sort of resist, we don't like that daughter of. It has a connotation that often is, working class, associated with the working class, or associated with the aspects of being Indian that are difficult in Malaysia, I should say, not just the working class. But anyway, so there's that. And then Muniandi, which is a pretty, to me, it's a very caste specific name. It signals that this person is not of an upper caste. So there's a lot that in that title that different audiences might pick up on differently. And there, again, with the daughter of Muniandi, I'm not even sure that Malaysians who are not Tamil would know that, here's this person, not only she's a servant, but I'm underlining that she's not upper caste, she's not even middle caste. it's something that I think a Malaysian Tamil audience would pick up on.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, I guess a part of the question was, and you answered it wonderfully, is that the title, even chapter titles and headings do so much more than just there for the, like a lot of times I feel that people don't read the epigraphs in novels, they just skip over them. But epigraphs are so much a guidepost of how to read a novel, and we put them there for a reason. And same with chapter headings, they're not just, there for the heck of it or there for whatever. They definitely do a lot more legwork than might be thought of. So yes, and then you follow with the date, which I think is self-explanatory. It's part of the setting, it's part of the time period. Your beginning is so beautiful. I mean, I have to say, Preeta, I think you're such a phenomenal writer. This is so lovely. And it's very much, in fact, it starts out with atmosphere and the setting, and it's very description heavy. And I'm going to read actually the first, if you wouldn't mind reading, just
Sure.
perhaps the first two lines, maybe? Two lines, just so that the audience gets a feel of you reading it and what it sounds like.
Sure. There is, stretching delicate as a bird's head from the thin neck of the Kra Isthmus, a land that makes up half of the country called Malaysia. Where it dips its beak into the South China Sea, Singapore hovers like a bubble escaped from its throat. Good?
Yeah, I think we can do one or two more lines.
This bird's head is a springless, summerless, autumnless, winterless land. One day might be a drop wetter or a mite drier than the last, but almost all are hot, damp, bright, bursting with lazy tropical life, conducive to endless tea breaks and mad, jostling, honking rushes through town to get home before the afternoon downpour.
Okay, thank you. So here as we see, you open up with the landscape. And as we go further into this first paragraph and then into the second page, and almost at the end of the second page is where we're introduced to the characters. It's almost like a camera lens. The focus comes closer and closer and closer, in more and more inwards. So how did this opening come about? Was this something you always meant to write? Was it always meant to be this way? Did it go through significant revisions? What was your thinking behind this?
So this was, I'll answer the easiest question first. This was not always the opening, simply because the structure of the novel completely changed. Like in the beginning, I was telling the story chronologically, beginning at the beginning and ending at the end. And when I flipped that and decided to tell the story of that year backwards, then I had to write a new opening. And I think that in writing this opening, I looked at some of my favorite novel openings for the kind of novel that I wanted to write. And I've mentioned, many times when asked about my influences, for this novel in particular, I've mentioned Bleak House by Dickens, which was a big, it was at the back of my mind in many different ways. And so, Bleak House has a stunning opening all about the fog in London. And I think it signals, the fog becomes a metaphor for everything that Dickens wants to say about class in that novel. So I tried to, I'm doing something similar because this novel, or I tried to anyway, this novel is about time. So in the opening, I try to sort of introduce some of this idea of time being subjective, flexible, relative. I guess, okay. I was also trying to, one other thing that I wanted to point out, in that line, yesterday I was rereading the opening because I knew that I was going to be doing this, and that line caught me actually about the springless, summerless, autumnless, winterless land. And I thought, I was thinking, it's very important to me to always write for a Malaysian audience, I guess, broadly speaking. And yet that line, why we don't have seasons. So why did I choose to emphasize, every season that we don't have? Because it's kind of irrelevant, like we don't have any seasons, and every Malaysian already knows that. But I think one of the reasons one of the things that this opening is trying to set up is this idea of looking at ourselves of us looking at ourselves from the outside. And also, I guess it's a little bit of a foreshadowing because the US as a destination, as a idea plays somewhat of a role in the novel, and I think that line sort of signals that for the reader.
I really, that line really caught me. I really liked it when I was reading it. So just how you're so specific with the seasons in it, but because it's a negative, it just does so much paradoxical things in it, in that one line. You just mentioned that you actually had a different beginning when you were working with this novel chronologically. So how did it open then? And do you, just your thoughts of that particular opening, which you discarded because of chronological?
Yeah, there was so many, actually. There was several beginnings, and I don't remember all of them, but I remember that one of them began with Uma in the US. So just, I know many people, most of the audience probably hasn't read the novel, but there's a character that one of the daughters of the family goes to the US, and it began with her in the US in winter. And so that was one beginning that I very quickly realized I don't know, it just didn't have, I like to think of it as heat, or sometimes I describe it very abstractly as heat. It just didn't have that feeling and heat and sort of stake that, in the story that I wanted. And then I had another beginning. These are the two that I remember very clearly. That one, and I had one that began with the arrival of the servant in the household rather than with her departure.
Interesting. I should have perhaps asked you to do this in the beginning, but can you give a quick description of the novel, what it's about?
Yeah, so the novel is about upper middle class Malaysian Tamil family in which there's been a tragedy. The grandmother has just died under mysterious circumstances, and we know that they're sending their servant away very abruptly. And the novel, the two sort of overlapping, two intersecting stories in the novel. One is the story of that year, which is ending with the departure of the servant, but I go through that year backwards, beginning with her departure and ending with her arrival. So that's the 1 year, 1979 to 1980. And it's sort of the year that is central to, many things about this family, who they were, who they will become. That's kind of a key year. And that's I almost think of it as the main story of the novel, but then intersecting with it is the backstory, which is very much about Malaysian politics and how this family came to be who they are, why, what are some of the disappointments and dreams and ambitions that they've had.
Nice. So in the beginning, which is so description heavy, how do you balance what you're writing over there? Like when do you know that what you've said is enough, when it needs more? What were the decisions that can go into writing this way, into doing a atmosphere setting heavy opening?
That's such a good question. How do you know when you've done enough description?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we keep hearing.
It's a really hard question to answer.
Yeah, no, I think it relates for me, I guess, to pacing also, because we often hear so much about pacing these days, and how even writers who are extremely literary, like this opening definitely is, sort of are shifting towards writing something which has a quicker pacing, and I see that with a lot of writers, where before they might have started out with something like this. Now they're sort of shifting towards just quicker pacing, something that gets the story moving on, the hook with the bang. And these are, to use that dreaded word, quieter openings per se, which I personally love. I love openings like this, which take us into the setting, the atmosphere. But yeah, when does not, perhaps, not necessarily when do you know then perhaps, but what are your thoughts on different types of openings when it comes to quieter ones and ones which are where we're supposed to start with a bang and
Yeah. I mean, there's so many. I like so many different kinds of openings. I don't think I can say like this is my favorite type of opening, because there are some openings that just really start with a hook or a bang that I really love as well. But in terms of for this novel, it just felt like this was the kind of opening I needed. And how did I know when to stop? I guess I really just wanted and I don't remember, I wish I could remember more about, whether it was longer, did I cut it down? But I think I just really wanted to introduce this idea of time and to put the setting in place, but not just geographically, but with some of the cultural underpinnings of the setting as well. And then I thought once that's done, then, sort of, I mean, it's trying to be cinematic in a way, like it starts out with this big picture and then, zooms in on the family. So that's, once I thought that I had enough of the big picture, then to move to the family. Yeah.
So do you, and you've, like you said, you've written many drafts of this, or you've changed the beginning many times, but do you at all mirror or think about it when you're writing and with short stories, it's perhaps definitely much easier, but even with novels, at least I try to do this or think about this. Somehow my endings always come to me before anything else does, and then I work towards them. But with language, the way you've opened, did you mirror your ending of the novel? Was that a consideration at all, where if the ending would reflect the beginning and bookend in any way?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I and not just the ending. I think there were certain, images or stylistic, flourishes, quotes, whatever we want to call them, that I wanted to kind of bring back, at points in the novel that made sense. And I think that once I had written the whole thing, I'm looking at the ending now, and yeah, I mean, I think there were things that once I had the ending written, yeah, I mean, you're talking basically, or at least one of the things that could answer this question is whether I want to consciously do any foreshadowing in the opening. And I think, yeah, I think I tried to, in not just in terms of the plot, but also, yeah, I thought a lot about like weather and imagery, weather, WEATHER, and imagery and things like that. And so, yeah, I think I did try to do some, as you said, mirroring or foreshadowing, or yeah, reflecting.
Right. Bringing it full circle. Yeah. So when you read this now that you've had some space between it, is there anything you would change in it? I often find myself sometimes going through things, and even with a published book, saying that, changing things around. So do you?
Another really great question. Not with the opening, actually. I think I'm okay. I'm fine. I'm good with the opening. There are probably things in the rest of the novel. I mean, it's been so long, and I've had such a complicated publication history since this novel that I'm almost afraid to look at it. But I know that the parts of it that I can recall, there are some things that I might have done a little bit differently. But I don't want to, with the opening, I think no. I mean, would I make it less quiet? Would I cut down on some of the adjectives? No, I don't think so. I think that the novel as it ended up, I think this opening fits the novel that I did write.
I do want to say I did bring up the word quiet, but it seems more a publishing term to me as to how they differentiate things, because for me, a quiet novel opens with just as much of a bang, but in a different style and in a different way. I mean, the weather, the landscape, the everything, that is just, if we talk about opening with a bang or a hook, what it is to get the reader reading on. And there are readers who appreciate this, and for them, this is bang and hook enough, definitely is for me to go on reading. So this, I just want to differentiate that the whole quiet novel thing is not necessarily, something which doesn't have its own fireworks and doesn't have its own internal rhythm and system of pacing and having the reader read on. And this definitely doesn't, but just that it's a publishing term, which seems to have seeped in a lot to differentiate different styles of writing. Yeah. I think, I don't know how much time we have, but is there anything you'd like to add about your beginnings? What beginnings do you like?
I mentioned one. I was thinking about that today. There's also, I mean, the novel from which I've taken the epigraph to my novel, Waterland, which is a very different kind of opening because it does introduce the characters immediately right at the beginning. But it has some things in common, I think, with my beginning, sort of the focus on setting, like really just grounding the reader in that setting. I was looking at, some of the openings I really love that are not at all like mine, like the opening of A House for Mr. Biswas, which, 10 weeks before he died, Mohan Biswas was sacked, or something like that, which is so much, like, here we are, this is what happened, this is, so yeah, that, and I was thinking about also, I think I mentioned this earlier, the way that openings introduce the themes and concerns of the novels. And I feel like in all of these talks that I've done recently, I seem to only talk about dead white male authors, and they're not all I read. I feel incumbent upon me to say, but the examples that I come up with, another favorite novel that introduces, sort of the philosophical and thematic underpinnings of the novel is The Go-Between, where the first sentence is the now very famous quote, "The past is a foreign country, they do things differently there." And I think that it's such a, it's just one very impactful sentence, and immediately tells you that the person who's speaking, the speaker is preoccupied with the past, and that's going to be what the novel is about. Yeah, so those are some of my favorites. There are many recent novels whose openings I greatly admire, but off the top of my head, I'm going to return to those sort of like key texts whose openings I often think about.
All right. Well, yeah, that might be the ending of our opening here. So, yeah, thank you. Who is next? Sugi, are you?
I think so. Next, I think I'm going to. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I'm going to be talking about Sugi's book.
Yes.
Sugi's opening is the order. Did I get the order right?
Yes.
Is everyone else? Okay. Okay. All right. So I am going to be talking about Sugi's book, which is Love, Marriage. Sorry, I just called you Sugi, and I realized maybe you'd prefer to be addressed by a professional name. Sweetie Ganeshananthan's book, Love, Marriage, which is a beautiful novel about a Sri Lankan American family. So I don't know, would you like to read the excerpt, just that one, we decided on just that one, what's
Sure.
on the first page? Would you like to?
Sure. I'm happy to I'll just read the first page.
Yeah.
In this globe-scattered Sri Lankan family, we speak only of two kinds of marriage. The first is the arranged marriage. The second is the love marriage. In reality, there is a whole spectrum in between, but most of us spend years running away from the first toward the second. Among the categories that bleed outside these two carefully delineated boundaries, the self-arranged marriage, the outside marriage, the cousin marriage, the village marriage, the marriage abroad. There is the marriage without consent. There is the marriage under pressure. There is even marrying the enemy, who, it turns out, is not an enemy at all. You cannot go unfettered into a family's history if you are one of them. The nature of certain unions will be hidden from you, rephrased to you, the subject dropped, the music changed. There is proper marriage, there is improper marriage. This Tamil family speaks of the latter in whispers.
Okay, thank you so much. So I think one of the things that I would love for you to talk about is, earlier when I was talking about my own opening with Sonia, I talked a little bit about how I tried to set up or present or lay out the themes that the reader might expect to encounter in the novel. And for me, that, just the very general idea of time. But I thought it would be interesting to hear from you about how do you feel this opening and, the categories of marriage that it lays out and this idea of family that it lays out, how do you think it relates to, all of that relates to the themes of the novel, the concerns of the novel?
Sure, thank you. So the novel is from the point of view of a young Sri Lankan American woman who is Tamil, who lives in the United States. And so the novel is in a first person, but here in this opening, it's presented almost as a kind of third person. So there's like a little bit of slippage. There's also kind of direct address to the audience. And I think, like you, I'm trying very much to write for my community in the sense of, writing for a diasporic Tamil community, and specifically people with connections to Sri Lanka. And so it's addressing in some sense also that reader. And, here it is laying out a binary that I think identifies the ways that a lot of people speak about marriage, which is a pretty significant institution in our culture, and sort of one that we spend a lot of time talking about. But then also the ways that the kind of official categorizations you can see in kind of the second paragraph, they decay a little bit, sort of the categories get less and less and less official. And so it's a little bit of a metaphor for the politics of the book. I think, it has the title Love Marriage, and it is a political novel. I think marriage is also a political institution. And it's also, I think, a way that at the time, and maybe even now, that I think about the relationship sometimes between the citizen and the nation state. In what way did you choose to enter that relationship? Under what circumstances? How might that relationship change over time? Who might have arranged it? And with what degree of love are you actually in that relationship? And so I think those are some of the themes that are being introduced here. And then, of course, also the notion of, like, right in the third word, globe scattered. It is a family that is all over the world. And so the narrative takes place in the United States. It also takes place in Canada. I'm an American who wrote a book set mostly in Canada, which sometimes befuddles people. Why should an American be interested in anywhere else? But, there's also bits in England and bits in France. So kind of trying to get that scattered nature of the diaspora in there.
Yeah. Since you mentioned that word that comes up, globe scattered, very early, it's like third word, first adjective. I thought also, I caught, even the first time I was reading this, but again on a rereading, I there's so many words that I wondered so much whether they were conscious choices, because they're like signals, they really just light up, this word choice. Some that I listed were, running away, bleed, boundaries. Were those words that the first draft already contained those, or did you, were they sort of more conscious choices to, sort of ideas or images that you wanted at the back of the reader's mind from the beginning?
Thanks for that question. I think I started writing this book when I was very young, and I finished it about 8 years later. And actually, in most of that time, this first page remained unchanged. I don't think there was a lot of conscious thought going into it. I could act like there was, but then I would just be lying. And so I think a lot of that was in there, and it sort of led me towards the rest of the book. And I think that I had what for me now feels like a significant advantage of not knowing that I was writing a novel when I wrote this first page. So then, one can sort of embrace one's hubris and just kind of not worry too much about what might happen. Oh no, I'm writing a novel. What if it goes wrong? Oh no, I've simply messed around on a single page. So I had kind of that freedom, and then also kind of the authority of that, the unknown future of this page, kind of to mess around with whatever words I wanted. And as a result, I think, considering that it's coming from a narrator who is diasporic, young, all of those things, kind of a character who is learning, it ends up being a beginning with some authority, I think, which is interesting. She's willing to name things and to call them things, and then also to puncture those categories. So I guess I'm grateful to my younger self for not having any idea what she was doing.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, you mentioned authority, which is something that I had noted too, and sort of this balance between the very authoritative voice, we speak, she doesn't brook any dissent. But there's also a more tentative undercurrent, like there's a sense of a sharing of confidences that maybe she isn't used to sharing. There's a lot, I think there's so much that we can infer about the narrative from this opening, but one thing that you don't reveal in the opening, there's so much that we can sense about the narrator's character, but not the narrator's gender, which doesn't become clear until quite a bit, few pages later. And I wondered if was that a conscious decision, or how did you, at some point you anyway must have realized, oh, this does not reveal her gender, and you stuck with that. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. That's interesting. I guess I think that often when writers write about marriage, and it's interesting here to think about, unmarriageable actually as an example, which we'll talk about later, right? When the word marriage is in a book title, or there has, I think, for a very long time been the notion that this is kind of the province of women. And actually, right, I mean, this is very heterosexist and heteronormative, but also for most of history, marriage as a state institution has been between a man and a woman. I'm not saying that it should still be that way, but right, I mean, it's not like marriage doesn't also include men as an institution. So I think that was something that I was thinking about as I wrote the book. It's a novel about women. It does also have some significant characters who are men. And I think I was also interested in kind of busting up the notion a little bit that, right, that that there's something trivial writing about marriage. Like, I think marriage is actually, right, it's one of our defining cultural institutions, the way in which we enter into it. This character is from a Hindu family. And so also, right, one of the things that isn't mentioned on this first page, or that is euphemized in some way throughout the novel actually, is caste, which you also spoke about. And so this is a family that is caste, there's caste marked practices going on in here. And sometimes I wonder how much an American reader, or just even a non-Hindu reader, or someone from a community, certainly there are communities that practice caste that are not actually Hindu, since that also has bled outside carefully delineated boundaries, right? But if someone is from a community that doesn't have caste, would that actually be recognizable in the book? Because the book actually sort of mirrors the way that the community itself addresses caste, which is to say, following some of those practices, but not actually discussing them in those terms. So I've wandered considerably away from your question, but
no, this is great. Yeah, no, it's all related. Yeah. So I just want to bring us back to something also that you were talking about earlier, about the list of categories. And I mean, whether in an opening or anywhere in a novel, I really love lists, and I love, lists, and that's a whole other panel that could be done, I suppose, lists in literature. But so you have this list, the self-arranged marriage, the outside marriage, the cousin marriage, the village marriage, the marriage abroad. And again, there is that voice of authority, like, I know what I'm talking about. This is my subject, and these are the categories. And then that sentence ends, and there are three other categories that the narrator then tacks on, and each of these categories has its own sentence, which struck me. I mean, it breaks the rhythm and draws attention to these, and suggests almost that the narrator is thinking aloud and coming up with these categories now as she speaks to us. These were not in the existing catalog, but there's, there without consent, there is the marriage under pressure, there is even, it's almost like she's thinking aloud. And so you mentioned earlier how the categories become more inexact, or less official, I think is what you said, as we go on. And so I guess I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the sort of pre-existing categories, and these three categories that the marriage without consent, the marriage under pressure, the marrying the enemy, which are nevertheless capitalized to signal that they are categories, but might be new categories that are invented for this novel, or that are new ways of talking about categories that no one ever admitted were categories before.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I think, right, I think certainly as a young person listening to conversations or reading about these, practices of marriage in Tamil diaspora communities, or even just kind of within families, the ones in the first bit of that sentence, the self-arranged marriage, the outside marriage, the cousin marriage, the village marriage, the marriage abroad, like these were all sort of things that I had heard, right? And outside marriage in some ways, right, is referring to caste or community in some way. The cousin marriage, let's keep all that land in the family. The village marriage, which also in some ways can refer to caste, or even just kind of a kind of insularity. The marriage abroad, which I think specifically among Sri Lankan Tamils who are a war-affected community, the marriage abroad has been a form of migration, really. And it's interesting, I just reviewed a book about this, which I thought was spectacularly good, Siddharthan Managuru's book, Marrying for a Future, which I reviewed for Himal South Asian, which in some ways is about these different categories of marriage and how war-affected Tamils have chosen to marry, or how they have, what sorts of strategies they've used to kind of both be with the people they love and also to secure, the opportunity to migrate, people who have kind of persisted in their romances despite various forms of displacement, disenfranchisement, refugee status denied, et cetera, et cetera. So it's funny, that book came out long after my book, but it strikes me as a really good naming of these sorts of categories. And in that book, you can also find things like the marriage without consent, meaning sort of, right, the implied figures there, the parents. Right. And it was funny, actually, after I remember when this book came out, I got a few notes from people that were sort of like, the parents in your book are so nice. Like there had never been South Asian parents in a book who were nice. Whereas like so many of the South Asian parents I know are so loving and, not that they're flawless, but I think that was another thing that I was kind of interested in exploring, the relationship between parents and children, the marriage under pressure, right? Coercion, which is also a thing that sometimes parents exert. And then there, sort of the suggestion of conflict, either within a family or ethnic conflict, is in the last sentence. Marrying the enemy, who it turns out is not an enemy at all. So that, again, I think was something that I was interested in puncturing. I'm speaking here about Sri Lankan Tamils like they are, like that's a porous community like any other. And so you can find, even for example, among my own family, like there are people who are Tamil and Sinhalese. And Sri Lanka has a number of minority communities. And so that was also something that I was interested in getting at.
Yeah. I think it's that category, marrying the enemy, that really signaled to us that this is going to be a political novel, which it very much is. And yet, even though it's a very political novel, marriage is both in the title and in the opening. But then with this category, you let us sort of glimpse, the fact that there's going to be a very tight connection between marriage and politics. How would you describe that connection in the larger novel? Like, what is the connection between the political story that you want to tell and this idea of marriage, or these ideas of marriage, these multiple ideas of marriage?
Sure. So the narrator of the novel travels to Canada with her parents because her uncle, who has been missing for some time, sort of resurfaces. And it turns out that he is terminally ill, and that the Tamil Tigers, of whom he has been a part, like a very early figure, have kind of released him, which I think is from my understanding, this is a thing that had sometimes happened. And so around the time that the novel takes place, it wouldn't have been possible for him to come to the United States because the LTT was banned in the United States. But in Canada, people who had connections to the Tigers were sometimes being accepted as refugees or asylees. And so this uncle comes to Toronto, where of course there is a large Sri Lankan Tamil population. And she goes to Canada, and she's coming from the United States. And so she's coming from a much more geographically dispersed community. She doesn't actually know a lot of other Tamil people. And for the first time, she's kind of in a city that's very dense with people who know a lot more about her culture. And so she's hearing about all of these things. And then also as she meets her uncle, she hears a lot of stories about other women in her family and the circumstances under which they've been married. Her uncle tells her a lot of stories. And her uncle, it turns out, is also a person who attempted to interfere in her parents' marriage. And so she has the opportunity to decide how she might want to reconcile her feelings about her uncle, who she feels affection for and who she's interested in, but also, you know, his militant past and her increasingly kind of conflicted feelings about the war. And so marriage sort of provides a lens for her to look at the family and at the history of women in the family, and to think about how militarization has affected civil life in Sri Lanka, and specifically the lives of women and children, which is a topic that I'm sort of interested in as both a fiction writer and a nonfiction writer.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a great answer. You alluded earlier to the fact that, you know, you said when you began work on this novel, you were very young and it took you 8 years, or did you say 7, 8 years? And I wondered, so during that time, the political situation in Sri Lanka evolved, changed. How did that change your, how did that affect your work on this novel? And did it change your feelings or what you felt the opening should be? How did it, as time progressed, how did you feel the opening was continuing to reflect or not reflect, what was happening in Sri Lanka? And
Sure.
Did you try to, yeah.
Thank you. So, and I started writing the book probably in 1999. And at that time, that was pre-Rajapaksa. And so I had grown up really kind of knowing about the war and didn't really expect it to ever end. And then in 2005, the Rajapaksas, came into power, and Mahinda Rajapaksa specifically, and he was in power until 2015. And I finished the book in 2007. It was printed in 2008. And as context for our audience, Preeta and I were on book tour together back then, which was great fun. And, but then, yeah, I think, I finished the book, and then basically between when I finished the book and when I went on book tour, the war began to end. Mm-hmm. And it is now very interesting and weird to go back and read certain sections of my book, including this opening, and think about, I think that the idea of marriage as a political metaphor gained resonance I didn't entirely expect it to have. And then also, from the point of view of the character in my book, also, the war doesn't end. So I then went on book tour with and had in a lot of my audiences, a lot of people who felt really strongly about the war and who wanted to talk about it. And I hope that the book was a way to do that. But also, I mean, in the book, it essentially doesn't happen. So that there's kind of a rupture of time there.
Yeah.
And of course, now, after the recent elections in Sri Lanka, the SLPP, the Rajapaksas swept to a really decisive victory, which I think really bodes ill for minorities in Sri Lanka, for kind of the rise of authoritarianism. And in many ways, I think a lot of the stories that's come up in this book, I hope that, under the Rajapaksas and their previous administration, when Mahinda Rajapaksa was president, it's now his brother Gotabaya. Like, there was a lot of repression of minorities, and a lot of people who were interested in democracy and devolution and demilitarization spent a lot of time kind of hammering at those things, myself included, I think. But the rise of authoritarianism kind of around the world, I think, is also going on in Sri Lanka.
Right. Yeah. Very much so. Yeah, we're seeing that. So I don't know, do we have a couple more minutes? I'm unable to keep track of time actually on this screen.
I think that we should maybe go on,
okay.
But thank you so much for such lovely questions.
That we have time for everyone.
Yeah, and then we can also come back and have the audience questions, which it looks like are starting to pile up, which is very exciting. So I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you so much, Rita. And I think now I am going to talk to Tania about her spectacular book, The Tusk That Did the Damage. Tania is the author of the novel Atlas of Unknowns and the short story collection Aerograms. Her fiction has appeared in Boston Review, Granta, Guernica, One Story, A Public Space, and the Kenyon Review, and she lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband and son. Tania, I wonder if you would start us off by reading maybe the first section of Tusk, like maybe the first 4 paragraphs.
Sure. Thank you so much to the festival. It's been so wonderful listening to you guys. I kind of forgot that I'm on a panel for a while. Okay. So I'm just going to read. Yeah. Okay. This section is called The Elephant. There are 3 perspectives in the novel, one of a poacher, one of an elephant, and one of a documentary filmmaker. Here we go. He would come to be called the gravedigger. There would be other names, the Master Executioner, the Jackfruit Freak, the great Surya Mangalam Sri Ganeshan. In his earliest days, his name was a sound only his kin could make in the hollows of their throats, and somewhere in his head, fathoms deep, he kept it close. Other memories he kept, running through his mother's legs, toddling in and out of her footprints. Is that all right? I could stop there.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'm gonna see if I can, I'll leave the screen share up. So this novel is such a joy to read, in part because of the intensity of that point of view that you were just talking about. And this is your third book. You'd written Atlas of Unknowns, which is also a novel, and then a short story collection, Aerograms, and then The Tusk That Did the Damage. Can you talk about how you got excited about being in Elephant Point of View?
Yeah, it was a long time ago, but I can kind of remember the excitement. That's such an important word, excitement. You need that to start a novel, right? I remember hearing about an actual wild elephant who was somewhere in Kerala and had gone rogue and was killing people, but then after he trampled the victim, he would bury the victim. And elephants have very elaborate grieving rituals for their own kind. But this was sort of a very strange aberration in elephant behavior. And so I kind of knew I really want to write about this elephant. But I didn't really know a whole lot about elephants. So I started actually by writing a first person point of view of an elephant. And I don't know, have you read like Kafka's Report to an Academy? It's from the voice of of an ape, or I don't know, I feel like writers sometimes do this. Raj Parmeshwaran has a wonderful story from the first person point of view of an elephant. And I kind of love that playfulness. So I thought I initially started with a kind of playfulness. And then but it kind of ran out of steam pretty quickly because I realized that I was also going to be writing about a poacher. I was going to be writing about a documentary filmmaker, and their voices felt very kind of contemporary. And it just, that fanciful first person elephant just was not harmonizing with those other voices. And I also concurrently was doing a lot of research into elephant behavior and psychology. And the more I kind of understood about elephant behavior, the more I felt like I realized I was just, by writing in the first person, I was just trying to avoid the tougher thing for me, which was kind of taking seriously the interiority of an elephant. And so I think a lot of times we've probably all done this, where when you're starting your novel, you're kind of writing around the thing that's scary. You're kind of trying to avoid doing the scary thing. And so you try all these other things. And then so finally I just was, I think, for me, it came with this opening scene, I thought, if I can access his emotional relationship to his mother, that's something I understand. And that's something that I can portray on the page. And so I sort of had accrued a lot of sort of knowledge by then about how elephants perceive their environments and their connections within the herd and things like that, or their clan. And so that kind of gave me the courage to just go ahead and do it. It took a while.
And so it's interesting that you also, you do have, the poacher or the filmmaker, but you start with the elephant. That takes some guts. Was it always the elephant?
It was always the elephant. I think I don't know if it's guts or I just wasn't, I read, after I finished the novel, I read this fiction manual that said, no, don't anthropomorphize animals. Don't give human traits to animals. And I just had forgotten that was a rule. I don't know, maybe if I'd read that rule ahead of time, I would have been I would have had to summon my guts more. But I kind of, how you're just kind of trying to please yourself in the first draft, at least for me. I'm just trying to entertain myself. And this was kind of entertaining for me, even if, it's a very grim scene, this opening scene, and his whole life is pretty grim. But it somehow was fun to kind of turn off the visual sense, because elephants have actually somewhat bad eyesight, but they have really wonderful sense of smell, and to sort of, that constraint became a kind of creative, a creative challenge. Like how would you perceive your world if you could only perceive it through a very, very strong sense of smell? So I don't know, things like that were fun to me. I don't know. I feel like you have to kind of proceed blindly and fearlessly, but I that's not because I'm just a fearless person. It's just because I was somewhat ignorant of the rules,
Well, I feel like every novel I love breaks at least 5 rules that I previously held dear, and does it so beautifully that I just wish to imitate. And I think here, I think of your book as one of several that I think of as kind of, right, the Anthropocene is, that's sort of a topic of conversation now. Like, what does it mean that we live in a people-centric world? Like, should we have been living in a people-centric world? And I think of your book as a piece of fiction that was kind of asking that question and puncturing it, and other writers kind of in that vein being, I don't know, anyone from like William Maxwell's So Long, See It Tomorrow has this like great dip into dog point of view, or like Sigrid Nunez's The Friend also has this great dog, or Jeff Vandermeer, who is best known for writing sci-fi, like has talked about this kind of, and writing from animal point of view. How did you do the research on the elephants? Were you hanging out with elephants?
I was hanging out with elephants, and I expected them to reveal all kinds of secrets to me, and they didn't. And that's the funny thing, because I was like, I'm going to go, I'm going to go to these. I went to multiple wildlife parks. I went to multiple elephant sanctuaries. And the interesting thing was I just didn't get a whole lot out of that. And that's just, that in retrospect, that's so obvious that, animals, fundamentally, there will always be this divide, between us, even if it's your dog that you've known forever. They have their own language and their own closed way of being, and no amount of research that we do will ever really release all of those secrets, in part because we sort of interpret. I think we kind of like place our biases on other animals, and so we sort of interpret them through our own human lens. So I would go to these places and I would just sit and watch them for a long time, and I can kind of get a interesting sense of how they chew or how they move, but really I had the research I did with like with elephant psychologists or animal behaviorologists was much more helpful. But I did want to, I don't love doing a lot of research, and this is a problem for me sometimes, but I just feel like I just want to do enough that I can write the scene, and I don't really want to become like a elephant expert in the way that scientists have to be, because I just think I need to have enough freedom to be able to move away from what I know and into the mysteries of what I don't know. And so, but that's in part why I kept in those elephant chapters, the layout is different. Like there's a kind of white space between the paragraphs. And I did that. I felt like I wanted some kind of silence around the elephants' perceptions, because I felt like I wanted them to be, there to be still some mystery to the way it's thinking and being. That's different from the layout in the other sections, the human sections.
That's so interesting. I think especially as I'm thinking about this book and kind of the evolution of your work, I'm going to cheat a little bit here. You have written 3 books, and one of them is a short story collection. So you've written 2 novels. How have thoughts about openings changed? I mean, everyone on this panel, I think, is also a short story writer, but you have published a collection, and that means, you begin anew every time. How do you think about novel and short story openings differently? And also, how have your thoughts about openings changed over kind of the course of your career?
Okay, I want to ask you the same question. That's such a great question, because I feel like teaching has made me think about openings a lot more than I used to before I taught. And I think a lot about, I love talking about openings. I think I've become more interested in openings, which all of yours somewhat do, but openings that to some extent do, but openings that sort of give us some kind of sense of how to read the book, or or some sense of where the book is going to go. Not a clear sort of roadmap, but you know, I think novels, all of these novels that we're talking about today, they all have a kind of, they're signaling certain thematic notions, and I don't know that I really thought about that as much when I wrote my first novel. I kind of just tricked myself into thinking I was just writing about some people and it would go on for however long. But now I think I'm, you know, for better or worse, I'm more, you know, purposeful about what, is this a novel or is this a short story when I'm starting? And I like this trick that Jim Shepard, this novelist, mentioned in an interview that he does with his short stories, that when he finishes a short story, he reads the last line and then he immediately goes back and reads the first line. And he says that, you know, the last line should be somehow in conversation with the first paragraph of his story. And I don't know that that always works with my stories, but I've always liked that idea that somehow, and this is maybe true of novels too, that somehow the beginning and end are in a conversation if you cut out the whole middle or everything in the middle. That makes novel writing sound so easy, right? It's just
oh, it's cake. But yeah, I think that's also kind of in line with what Sonia was saying too, Preeta, about that kind of the way that you get to the end and you're a little bit like, oh, now I know that my beginning is correct/incorrect/ what have I done? I want to slide in one more question, and then I would love to talk to you, all of you, forever, but I also definitely want to hear about Unmarriageable. So my last sneaky question for you is, I know that you were trained also as a filmmaker, and I'm curious about how you think about openings in film compared to openings in books.
Oh, that's very good, Sugi. That's very sneaky. I think that maybe it's that, you know, when Sonia was talking about how there's a kind of push, or more common nowadays, that novels begin with a bang, and I do feel like that's something that has, I feel like there's a certain language of film that is like that literature has begun to borrow as books start to kind of compete more and more with like Netflix and things like that. But yeah, I don't know. I think my favorite kind of filmic openings, if I'm being honest, are ones that have a kind of visual language and that kind of set up a tone or a mood, and before anybody says a word. And I'm having a hard time, you know, coming up with an example. But I feel like I've always kind of, and perhaps, you know, there's something to be said for the novels that do this too. I think Preeta's opening does this, where it's a kind of, it's just a kind of entry into the world before anyone speaks. And I really like that kind of opening. That to me feels, I don't know if you said this, Preeta, but it does feel kind of cinematic. But I remember from working on documentary films that you're really not trying to announce what you're talking about from the front. You're really trying to kind of create an atmosphere more than anything else. At least that's what we were always trying to do. But yeah, I'm gonna keep thinking about that one. It's a good question.
Thank you so much. And I think now I will turn it over to you to talk to Sonia, and I will pull up her book. Thanks.
Thank you, Sugi. Hi, Sonia. I'm so excited to talk about your book. Well, first, let me just say a little bit about you. This is your second novel, I think, Unmarriageable, Pride and Prejudice in Pakistan. And your debut novel was, you know, very well received, and it's called An Isolated Incident. And you grew up in Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and England, and now you live in Atlanta, Georgia. And I was wondering if you would read, well, however long you want to read, but just the opening of your novel, Unmarriageable.
Sure. Let me read what's up on screen, so if anyone wants to follow that. So, chapter 1. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a girl can go from pauper to princess or princess to pauper in the mere seconds it takes for her to accept a proposal. When Elizabeth Bennet began working at age 20 as the English literature teacher at the British School of Dalipabad, She had thought it would be a temporary solution to the sudden turn of fortune that had seen Mr. Barkat Park Binnat and Mrs. Khushbu Pinky Binnat and their 5 daughters, Janisba, Lisba, Marisba, Kitiara, and Lady, move from big city Lahore to backwater Dilipabad. But here she was 10 years later, 30 years old, and still in the job she'd grown to love despite its challenges. A new batch of 9th graders was starting Pride and Prejudice, and their first homework had been to rewrite the opening sentence of Jane Austen's novel. Always a fun activity and a good way for her to get to know her students better. After Alice took attendance, she opened a fresh box of multicolored chalks and invited the girls to share their sentences on the blackboard. The first to jump up was Rose Nama, a crusader for duty and decorum, and one of the more trying students. Rose Nama deliberately bypassed the colored chalks for a plain white one, and Alice braced herself for a reimagined sentence exalting a traditional life: marriage, children, death. Thanks.
Wonderful.
And just my accent code switches a lot. And the first language I learned to read in was in English. So it slowly starts to go there, which is, if you heard that, that's why.
That's wonderful. You're very flexible. So I love the homage as a form. And so for me, it's always a delight, the suspense comes from, well, where is she going to create these intersections? And so the suspense you might get from not having read, Pride and Prejudice changes when you do know the source material. And I feel like most people who write homage type things, they sort of hide the source material a bit more. And I thought it was kind of really bold and new, unique, the way you place the text within the text in the opening chapter. So I have a lot of questions about that. And one of the questions I have was, I'm interested in what made you decide to refer so directly to Pride and Prejudice in this scene. But yeah, we can start there. Yeah, what made you decide to place it so directly?
Well, like the subtitle says, Pride and Prejudice in Pakistan. So this literally is Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice set in Pakistan. It's not a sequel, it's not a prequel, it's not an inspired by, it's not a based upon. It's literally what it says it is. And the reason for that is because I was doing what I call a parallel retelling. And I was doing it for post-colonial reasons. As we know, British Empire, the reason I'm at least speaking English, or many of us are, and growing up with British classics rather than perhaps something that is more indigenous to the country. And one of my epigraphs is from Thomas Babington Macaulay, and it talks about he's giving an address to British Parliament in 1835, and he literally sets linguistic policy for British Empire, which was to replace all officialdom with English. And I read that as an adult. I was doing my own reading and came upon it, and it was shocking to me to see the somewhat nefarious roots of wanting to create, as he says, people brown in skin, but white in English in sensibilities. And then to hear this language, which is my language too, and it's English is an official language of Pakistan, but to see its roots was very disturbing to me. And I immediately, I think, wanted to, how to put it, talk, have a conversation, if not talk back, have a conversation with Empire. And, and we come from, many of us have countries which have discomforting or uncomfortable histories, as we see today, and what to do with them. I don't necessarily think, and this is one of the themes in Unmarriageable, that erasure or not talking about them is the way to go, but rather perhaps fusing them and acknowledging them. And for me, one of the ways to do that was very much to take a British classic. Jane Austen is a favorite author of mine. But to take a British classic, and I chose this one for various reasons, and take the English language I've grown up with and the Pakistani culture that I've grown up with and fuse the two. So for me, there was never any question about what I was doing. It wasn't just, an homage per se. It was very much a post-colonial reckoning with my own history, and which is why it is exactly Pride and Prejudice. The plot is the same. All the characters from Pride and Prejudice are in here, of course, with some new characters, and I've changed my characters have different things going on also, but it is very much Pride and Prejudice. And that is the reason Jane Austen is in this novel too. And I refer to her. Yeah. She comes constantly. Yeah.
one of the things in this opening scene, the exercise that she has the girls do, each girl comes up and kind of reinvents the opening lines of Pride and Prejudice. And I thought that was kind of brilliant. And I don't know if this is your intention, but to me, it sort of signals that you're going to be, it's very playful, it's funny, but it's also, there's talking about, profound questions about how women can or should define themselves. And I just thought that, in the same way the girls are reinventing Jane Austen, that's basically what you're doing. I thought, but it was a really brilliant and funny way to do that. But I was wondering, to me, I would imagine taking on one of your great iconic novels is a bit daunting, at least at some point. Perhaps not, but for everyone, but I would find it daunting. But I wondered if you had sort of blundered into different, what gave you the kind of courage to sort of give us this opening?
Yeah, it took, I'd been wanting to do this for a very long time, for many, many years, but it was daunting is an understatement. I was really, taking on taking on Jane Austen and then within Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice in the way I wanted to retell it was, yes, it was extremely scary. And the other thing I wanted to do was, and I think you'd mentioned it at some point, that I was almost writing two novels. I was writing one novel which was, very much for people coming from Jane Austen, coming from Pride and Prejudice. But on the other hand, I was also writing a novel which could be standalone for those who know nothing about her, not coming from her. So a huge challenge in the opening itself and otherwise was really how to balance these, how to write two novels in one without either one taking away from the other, or any reader coming from these two different streams being able, feeling discomforted or uncomfortable. That was a big challenge. But, for me, the one thing I always, I will say, I wrote this novel in 2 months. Which turned out to be a blessing because I wanted to write it for a long time. I didn't have the courage. I didn't even think about it. I just knew I have to do this post-colonial thing. This is a burden on me historically. I have to do it. Oh my God, who am I to do this? Can I even do this? So, all those intimidating questions kept running through. And then it so happened I joined a 4-year MFA full-time. And there was a glitch in the syllabus. And instead of having a year, 2 years to do your thesis, this was my thesis. I had 2 months to deliver an entire novel. And that was really, like I say, blessing in disguise, because suddenly I didn't have time to worry about what I was taking on, what I was trying to do. Would I do it well? Would anyone read? I had to turn in a thesis. And I just wrote it. And I sent it in an hour before deadline. My professors got back to me and said, send it to your agent, sent it, and he sold it fairly quickly. So I don't even know what happened there, except that perhaps at some point things are in you, they're meant to be written, and that artificial circumstance of 2 months really helped. So to connect that back to the beginning, because I didn't have, honestly, Tania, time to ponder in this 2 months is ridiculous to write.
Yeah.
A novel, as we all know.
Yeah. Yes, I'm listening. I'm
Sorry?
listening. I'm listening.
Okay.
Okay, well, I'm listening too.
We're all listening. I'm listening to too.
Reduce the volume. Reduce the volume from your computer because I can't hear you.
Oh dear.
Who
All
are we
right.
talking to?
I don't know who that is.
Are they speaking to us?
Hello?
All right.
Okay. Let's just
So let me gather my thoughts. Yes, so to just connect that. Yes, so I was saying that I didn't have time to really think about how I should open it, how I shouldn't open it. What I did sort of loosely want to do is I knew I wanted to open with a retell, because it is a retelling. It's a parallel retelling. So I very much knew I wanted to open, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice opens with the iconic sentence. I have it memorized. You can all say it with me. It is, it's a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be one of a wife. So I knew that, yes. So I knew that, I knew I wanted to end unmarriageable with that sentence. So for me, it came down to bookends. So I definitely wanted to end with that sentence. And it just made sense to me then to start with a retelling of that sentence. And this particular sentence that I chose to open with, for me, really encapsulates the entire thematic material. As you said, Tania, the rest of the, the retellings of It's a Truth University Acknowledges in chapter 1 and up in the rest of the novel actually are nods to all the other themes. There's friendship, there's, what makes a good marriage, etc., what it means to, various things. But this one seems to be the universal umbrella thematically, which is, especially in certain traditional cultures and not, really the ring that you wear does determine where you and your children might end up in life, especially if you come from a culture or a family which has not equipped you financially to earn, and you're not just pocket money like a lot of women in Pakistan sometimes do, but earn enough of an income to live independently and make your own decisions. So this first line very much, and the last one bookended it for me, which is why it came. But like I said, for 2 months I didn't have time. I just zoomed through whatever came, I wrote it down, and this is how it got. So
that's wonderful. Nothing like a pressure to actually release the vows.
In this case.
Yeah. I wonder if I could ask.
No, I was just going to say my first novel took me 10 years to write, An Isolated Incident. So I didn't have, like sometimes people say, well, you have already written a novel. I'd written it a while back. It was very different, political. It took 10 years, a lot of research. So I really didn't have, for me, this was a completely new thing in every way.
I wanted to ask a craft question because this opening scene involves a lot of people, a lot of students, a lot of girls saying this and that. And then there's Elispa, the teacher, who's kind of, there's not that much narration. It's mainly dialogue, very dialogue heavy, but the dialogue tells us so much about all these different characters. And I wondered if you have any tips about writing dialogue or managing an ensemble scene and keeping all these voices distinct and clear. I mean, Roznama is so clear throughout the scene, this long scene. And so do you have any tips on dialogue or big scenes like this?
Yeah, not to be prescriptive either, but dialogue seems to be something that I will say comes a bit naturally to me. And now it won't, now that I've jinxed it, but it sometimes does. But with this scene, like you're saying rightly, there are a lot of characters in this scene. My main character, Alice, is a school teacher, and this is her, she's talking to her ninth grade. So there are a lot of girls there, all in uniform. So it was how to make them distinct, and their voices. I mean, I think with their voices and what they're saying, dialogue gives you the ability through tone and mood also, really. Dialogue is your key to setting your character's mood, right? Their internal atmosphere, their internal, who they are really, the word choices they use, the diction that particular character employs. Roznama might say something, and the facial expressions you can give them, the tics you can give them, all of that is very visible within dialogue. You were talking about being filmmaker, screen and stuff. Dialogue is almost your clothing in a way, your visual cues for what this character is saying. So I always go with that, with dialogue at least. But also in this scene, one way that I kept the girls apart was the use of, I grew up in a world of blackboards, okay, with multicolor, with chalk and stuff. And I was one of those irritating kids who'd be like, aren't you giving us any homework? I learned not to say it that fast, but still I was, what about homework, miss? But by the same token, which who wants to write on the black? Me. So very quickly, I was one of those. Which chalk color should I choose? But so one way I quickly, I was very specific almost about which color each girl is choosing. Because she picks that color, So that was one visual cue or one cue I was able to give to keep the characters fairly separate for myself also. So yes, the tone within the dialogue, but also the color sequence, the chalks really helped out with that in this.
Definitely. Yeah, that was a sort of masterful insertion because it allowed you to do so much without having to say too much. You just know by the way the girls are.
Yeah. One of the big complications that I had with this particular opening actually is that the quote that I open with is something that we find out, I think, on page 2, that the character Roznama has written on on the blackboard. And because I wanted to bookend the novel with this retelling and an Austen's quote, I just had to keep the sequence. And it did take me a bit of head scratching, wondering, how am I going to do this? How is the audience going to know that she did this, even though I don't start with her at the blackboard? So that took a little bit of manipulation and definitely craft and thinking, and the color chops again helped in that.
Yeah, it's brilliant. So I wonder if we should switch to take some of these questions in the chat in the time we have left. Sugi, do you want to kind of field them, or?
Sure. So this is a question for all of us as diasporic writers of Asian, Indian origin. What frames your writing process? Are you consciously alert to the fact that your readers would also include the Western audience, or do you dismiss that and write without that hindering your thought process? As if you were writing to people who would know the local mores, customs, and vocabulary firsthand, do you feel compelled to cater to a readership beyond that community? Thank you. I will defer to others to begin that.
Want to take this question, or?
Why don't you go ahead?
Well, I mean, I guess if I had to choose one of these, no, I mean, when I write, as I said, when it was my turn, I tend to, yes, I think of the Malaysian audience, but a Malaysian audience itself is such a diverse thing. I guess I'm writing for people like myself, really, and I really try to catch myself and do the opposite. I mean, if I find myself explaining or trying to sort of guide the Western reader through it, it's something I really try to excise from my writing quite consciously. Yeah, I mean, I think I write to people who I assume that people would know, you know, or that they would, not necessarily that they would know, but that they would appreciate that immersive experience, and not really either, you know, go and look it up, or as we used to read when we were kids, when we didn't have Google, you just immersed yourself. Some things remained a mystery, and that there's a kind of loveliness to that, I think, to not knowing and understanding everything. It's a very different kind of reading experience, and I think Western readers should have it too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I mean, I think when you first start writing, you know, when you're asked one of those questions on the questionnaire, who, you know, from the publisher, who is this novel for? You're like, everyone. This novel is for everyone, and their dead relatives too. But you know, as you become, as I think you become a bit more seasoned writer, you find your own voice and who your voice is speaking to, in a way, and that becomes your audience. And yes, it should be available and meaningful, hopefully, to everyone who picks it up. But I think when you're writing within a certain culture, be it Jane Austen writing in her time period, be it writing a book set in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, India, you know, Bangladesh, Nepal, any of our subcontinent, you know, geographical region, there are certain cultural specificities. And within each of these countries also, there's no monolith and there's no single story. So the more focused you get with the religion you're writing within, the geographical space, even the city you're writing within, it becomes, you know, in that respect, it becomes in a way more focused to who that specific audience might be. But on the other hand, it opens up also. I mean, every novel has geographical specificity. And for me, the biggest specificity is, at the end of the day, most novels are about a family. They're about a character and they're about a family. And the broadest definitions of that are, what does this family eat? Do they eat pizza? Do they eat roti? Do they eat sambar? What do they eat? And these are things that any, you know, so when I still say that, oh, it's for everyone, the fact is, it's food. Everyone should be able to relate to that, no matter what they're eating. So that's the way I write for myself. But at the end of the day, I'm hoping whoever reads it will be able to find the universalities within the specificities of what they're reading.
I would say for me, it depends on the thing that I'm writing. And I kind of, like, I wrote a story the other day or a while ago, that is really, you know, the audience, it's about Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, this film. And if you haven't seen the film, you really just won't understand the story. And I've come to feel okay with that. I've come to feel okay with the fact that not every story and every novel is for everyone, even though we've kind of bred on that. I came up in grad school with that notion that everyone should understand, have the same sense of what love is and have the same sense of what, marriage is, and just like these basic things that we should all understand and be on the same page about. But I think that tends to then erase a lot of experiences that are very specific and particular. And so sometimes I'm reading a novel and I just don't understand it, and I can't even contextualize what they mean. But I think that I hope that readers are becoming more and more okay with that, and trust that the author, if they're not telling you something, explaining something completely, that you're going to be okay, that you can still, there'll still be things that you can enjoy from the novel. But, I remember reading, The God of Small Things many years ago when it came out, and being just so overwhelmed by all the references, all the language, the Malayalam, I'm from Kerala, my parents are from Kerala, and how that added so many layers of understanding. And it's okay for readers who don't understand all those things. There's still a gorgeous novel that you can enjoy, but I think just having having trust in the author to kind of tell you what you need to know, and being okay with not knowing certain things.
Yeah, and I think giving yourself the permission to, if you're not, for me at least, I mean, I remember when Marilyn Robinson's Gilead came out, and it's set in a Calvinist atmosphere, and it seemed to, I believe it won the Pulitzer, and every book club was doing it, so I sat there for 3 book clubs and I reread it for each one. And I still really didn't get it. I'm not from that background. She hadn't explained. And the way sometimes writers of color have to explain a lot of things and put things within context, it was my first realization that there were certain writers who didn't have to do this. And it was interesting to me because obviously her novel made it to India and the subcontinent and stuff. It was available there also, and people were reading it and picking it up. And it just struck me then that how different writers, by dint of what is expected of us, shape the landscapes we write about, and how audience comes into that, and who we write for. Because I'm still quite lost with Gilead. I just gave up after a while. I was like, I don't know Calvinist religion. I don't know the beauty that people from that area, that religion, are finding in her words and what she's done. I'm not able to see that. And obviously that is okay. And if it's okay for her as a writer, then it should be okay for the rest of us also. And like Tania said, some books might not be for everyone, but if they reach that specific audience, then I think still job well done.
I think I will maybe take a pass on this question in the interest of getting to other questions also, since it seems like there are many, many questions. I do want to say that, Sonia, you wrote an essay that I really enjoyed about when you're authentic is someone else's exotic, which those of you who are attending this panel virtually, if you're looking for that essay, it's on LitHub. I'm going to ask one more question that is sort of addressed to all of us, and then there are a bunch that are specifically for different books, and then I'll go to some of those. So there's a question here about writing in English. We've been talking a little bit about talking back to empire and language. So the question is, you write in English. Do you read fiction in any other language? How do you think the language and culture influences the writers who write in English?
I don't read in any other language. So I feel like Sonia, maybe, or you, any of you?
I have very, very painstakingly over the past few years taught myself to read, not to read Urdu per se, but I come from a Muslim background, so you learn to read the Quran, which is the Arabic script, and the Urdu script is the same. So you do read it, but my litmus test of any being fluent in reading the language is in the newscast where they have the ticker news coming, underneath. And if you can read that really fast, you're fluent. I am nowhere near fluent, but I've tried to read in, you know, in Urdu, a couple of stories, Manto stories, etc. Very, but you know, languages obviously have their own flavor, their own idiom, their own everything. So for instance, with Unmarriageable, in the opening where Roznama comes in, for those who are familiar with Hindi, with Urdu, etc., they will know that Roznama actually means every day. It means daily news. And she is actually in the novel, for those who you know, understand the language, they immediately know she's sort of the voice of the everyday people in this context, and they get Roznama. And for those that don't, it's just, I figured it's a pretty sounding name, Roznama. So things do work on, you know, back to Marilyn Robbins' novel. I didn't get the Calvinist stuff, but obviously it worked on many different levels. So I gave myself the permission to do that within language also. And since we do write in English, but I'm assuming even if we can't read another language, we can perhaps understand another language, and those idioms and those phrases and stuff that we've perhaps heard our grandparents, our parents, when we go to when we visit Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, etc., where we're surrounded by those languages, those do seep, those rhythms, rhymes, especially in dialogue, do seep into our characters and stuff. So there's always an interplay, I think, of those of us who belong to more than one culture and more language, whether it's written, spoken, but necessarily heard also. A lot of us belong to languages that we've heard, even if it's high school French, high school Spanish, high school English, whatever. And those do seep into the work, I think, in myriad ways.
I'll take a stab at this answering this question. I do read in French and in Malay. I've actually being from Malaysia, and I went to state schools, government schools, you know, for 12 years. So the medium of instruction in Malaysia is not English, it's Malay. So I read both of those languages. I'm not going to include Tamil because I read it very, very painstakingly. It would take me like an hour to sound out a paragraph. So no, but I guess, yeah, I read in other languages. I don't write in them. And the whole question of Malay, Bahasa Malaysia is Malaysia's official language. But I have my position on this is that actually English, even though it's the colonial language, obviously, it's also the language that has the least, that sort of feels the most neutral at this point, at least speaking for people who read fiction, which is, again, a minority, you know, a small minority of the country. But Malaysian English, which I think I've said before, that it really feels like our national language in some way, because Malay, Bahasa Malaysia, which is the official language, is the language of the dominant ethno-cultural majority. And so, as you can imagine, it's politically complicated for minorities in Malaysia. So, yeah, I mean, I've sort of taken history is what it is. Like, I can't go back and change it. We were colonized, and English. My family, you know, middle-class Malaysian Indians also tend to speak English as a native language. So I've sort of taken, you know, English and tried to make it my own thing. Sonia was talking about, you know, writing back to empire. And I think that's something that, you know, if you're a writer of color from South Asia or Southeast Asia, that's something that is very present in your mind. And my project is to kind of take Malaysian English and see if I can make a literary language with it, which is not so clear in the novel that we talked about today, but something that I'm trying to do going forward.
Yeah, I've shifted from talking back to conversation with empire.
Yeah.
That seems smart. I will take a quick stab at answering this as well. But before I do that, I just want to say to my fellow panelists that if you look in the chat section, you'll see questions that are specifically for your book. And so maybe if you actually either want to come up with an answer that addresses several questions or select one to answer, I don't know that I want to pick for you. It might make more sense for you to pick yourself. And maybe we could do Tania, Soniah, Preeta after I answer this question. So I have studied Tamil off and on. I am a heritage speaker, I guess is the way that language instructors talk about it. I can read a little bit, but certainly not very well. But I think that even the syntax of my English is influenced by Tamil language patterns. For example, I don't know how many Tamil speakers there are among our listeners, but like, so for example, edita kondu vengo. So like there's an auxiliary verb, like I'm saying, take it and put it there, right? And so like the double nature of the verb is actually something that's reflected in my English, which I didn't realize until well after I wrote my first book. And then I sort of was looking back at my sentences in English and I was like, those are Tamil sentences. And so I think sort of my contrarian nature would lead me to say that English is a Tamil language, just as Preeta was sort of saying, like that, I can't change history. We're colonized. Marilyn Robinson was my teacher. And as, Sonia saying that the Calvinist stuff was maybe not sort of within the culture that she's familiar with. I sometimes find that there are ways in which our cultures and languages are porous that are not even evident to me until I kind of look back over my shoulder. So for example, there were missionaries with Calvinist training in northern Sri Lanka. Many, who knows, surely someone knows, but not me at this moment. But, a long time ago, there were Calvinist American missionaries in northern Sri Lanka. They started American missionary schools to train people in English. I have certain Calvinist tendencies to my personality that were not evident to me until I was reading an ethnography, which had a foreword from one of my former professors, E. Valentine Daniel, who's an anthropologist of Sri Lanka, in which he elucidated this connection. And I was sort of like, oh God, no wonder I like Marilyn Robinson. I'm a secret Calvinist. And so I think like those connections are also always there and I'm always discovering them. And that's a richness of English. I'm sort of reluctant to say that English belongs to other people since I feel that it's very much also mine. And that porousness of language that we were talking about, I also took high school Spanish. My Tamil has now superseded it to the extent that sometimes when I reach for a Spanish word, I can only find the Tamil. And also for a very long time, my brother's and my secret language was Spamil, which was on purpose constructed so that our parents could understand only 1/3 of what we were saying. So all of these things are also part of our cultures, and that messiness and something is a cool thing to see on the page, like when someone speaks in one language and someone else answers in another, which I think is very much part of the way that we speak and live now. And with that, maybe I'll turn it over to Tania to answer some questions about Tusk.
I will take the first question, and it says Mysore is very close to the elephant corridors and tiger reserves, so we are very involved in conservation and man-animal conflict. Your book speaks to conservation, animals, elephants in particular, conflict between forest officers and villagers. Could you speak to how the subject for your book came about and how you went about doing research for this book? So that's a great question. I started with the elephant perspective, as I said, and I was living in India at the time, so I had this sort of flexibility to go to different places. And the novel kind of quickly expanded to sort of include a farmer, because it's sort of impossible to tell the story of an elephant in South India without including the people who live around it. The competition for sort of space and resources is really integral to that story. And so I went to Wayanad, which is not far from Mysuru. And then I also went to Periyar, a wildlife park. I was just going to a lot of different parks, and probably the most difficult research I did was trying to find poachers. Obviously, poachers who are active poachers don't really want to do a lot of interviews, but I found at Periyar they had poachers they had been former poachers, and they'd been hired by the Forest Department as guides, which was kind of brilliant on the part of the Forest Department, because these poachers knew the terrain better probably than anybody else. And so it was a great, kind of conservation effort. And I think you can see this globally, that the best way to kind of encourage stewardship of land is to involve the local people who live there, and not to pit conservation against, local people or native peoples. And so that was very interesting to me, because I came to these poachers with all these Western preconceived notions that they must feel guilty, this must be terrible, and they must be ashamed, and I should be very careful and tread lightly. When in fact, they were very happy to kind of matter-of-factly tell me about the time they killed this baby elephant, and then the mother was here, and to describe these very grisly things. But in a way, when I think about it, why do we hold elephants so much more dearly than we do in America? Someone kills a deer, it's okay, it's just a deer. But these these notions of which animals are sacred are somewhat arbitrary. And, I think it made me question my own sort of assumptions as a Westerner coming in here, and assuming what they might be feeling about what they had done, about these poachers had done. And so a lot of my research, some of the great best sources were just people and just sitting on porches and talking to a farmer about what it really is like to have an elephant, run through your farm. I think as Westerners, especially Westerners, I knew that the challenge of this novel would not be to kind of get the reader on the side of the elephant. We just tend to feel empathy for elephants, but actually, ironically, getting the reader to feel empathy for the farmer, which is the human farmer, is much harder. And so I felt like, being able to talk to people who actually had experience, who could actually point to their own wounds about, having been attacked by an elephant, that was really striking to me. And it only made me feel more certain of the fact that this was a novel that would have to encompass a lot of perspectives. Yeah, thank you for the question. Who's going next? Does somebody else want to take a question?
I'll take the first one that came up as I scrolled up. The question is, has living in different countries influenced thinking in writing novels? Living in different countries, and I've grown up in quite a few. I think the first thing that strikes you is, as a child, you don't have a choice in the countries that you're living in. My parents certainly didn't ask me, now we are moving from England to Saudi Arabia, how do you feel about that? Do you want to go? You're just told one day, well, we're packing up, you're leaving school, you'll start school, new everything, whatever. And as a child, you sort of, I don't know if as a child, you emotionally understand the lack of agency and that who wants to leave their friends and stuff. As an adult, you understand that you actually had no agency in that. And I moved around a lot when I was a kid. And unlike army kids, military kids who move around, all of them move around together to different similar bases and stuff, because a lot of military kids, army kids tell me, oh, we lived in a lot of different places too. And then when I started to deconstruct that, they have a collective memory of bases and where they're going, whereas mine is very singular to me in a way. So it is isolating in a way. I have to say, one of the best moves and very formative for me were going to Saudi Arabia. It was obviously a Muslim majority country, but within that, I went to an international school, and there were kids. The student body was a mini United Nations. There were kids from everywhere, name the country, and there was, diplomats, embassies, whatever. There were kids over there. So I grew up I grew up in the United Nations. And by dint of that, because Saudi Arabia had books coming in, not just from England, but also the US and Australia and Canada. And then these class fellows of mine, schoolmates, would bring, from Nigeria, we'd have folk tales, and from Norway and Russia, Baba Yaga and stuff. From India, Amar Chitra Katha, I grew up reading those also. So there was so much of, I felt I had the world at my fingertips reading. I didn't put it in those words back then, but that is what it was. The one thing I didn't have growing up, I loved it. I just loved, I loved, and then there was TV. I grew up on what was then called Indian movies and now called Bollywood, Pakistani dramas, English movies, American movies, just everything. But the one thing I didn't see though was a book written in English but set in Pakistan. So what I started doing naturally, and perhaps a lot of us might do that, is I started transliterating. So if I read Scone in Enid Blyton, we read a lot of Enid Blyton back in the day as post-colonial children, I turn it into samosa. And bonnets, bonnets would be dupatta. I just started doing this naturally. It just became second nature. And what happens with that is that you tap through those specificities, you tap into the universalities. So if I'm reading a book set in, well, not Calvinist, but if I'm reading a book set in, other geographies, other cuisines and stuff, they very quickly became my own because I was able to translate what they were in my own culture per se. Growing up, of course, I realized that this seemed to be very specific perhaps to post-colonial children, growing up in an English language with British classics, or perhaps as an international student. because it seemed to me that a wide variety of Western audience and didn't have that same into books from different cultures and stuff. They might read them for educational purposes, but not necessarily seeing them as their own or relating to them as their own. So all of that really does, growing up in different countries and through different reading material, it did influence my writing per se. And I think with Unmarriageable, even with Isolated Incident too, but especially with Unmarriageable, being as it is a parallel retelling, what I hear a lot from people is that from readers who are not from Pakistan or the subcontinent, is that, they'll be like, oh, it's just like us. They're just like us. And I'm like, well, I'm glad you're Pakistani also. And, well, wonderfully enough, a lot of readers in India are discovering Unmarriageable. And I'm getting, it's interesting to see Indian readers and their perspective on the novel. And especially when they say stuff like, Pakistanis are just like us. It's not such a different culture after all. Muslims are not that different in Pakistan from us after all. And as a Pakistani looking, growing up on Indian films and stuff, this perspective is always fascinating to me because I've always seen the subcontinent as part of where I'm from, and that the countries are just there. So it's interesting when readers from this geographical location read Unmarriageable and then see themselves in this Pakistani culture and stuff. So yeah, but yeah, living in different countries definitely was transformative for me, seminal for me in every single way, and informs everything I write pretty much, probably at every level.
I don't know whose turn it is. Is it
if you would like to go, that would be great. Sure. And otherwise I can.
I thought of taking, there's a question that I think it's very similar. Two different people have asked versions of the same question. And so our friend Anita Manor has asked this question, and then one other person has asked a very similar question just to me. So I might just read them both, and then I can answer a little bit, and Sugi, you can add, you can answer the same question, because I think Anita wanted to ask both of us. Okay, so I'll read Anita's question first. Hi, Preeta and Sugi. Anita M from Cincinnati. I love how both of you contribute to decentering the primacy of India in South Asian diasporas, and am a fan of both of you. I am curious if you can later talk about what you're working on now. What about the novel form appeals to you? Ignore if this has been answered. And then someone else asked me, India and Indians feel very close to Malaysia, and your use of Tamil and Malay words and phrases evoke a very familiar sense of place. And of course, your language flows smoother than honey. Thank you. But one wants more. Is it possible to expect a book about Uma in the United States, or about Asha and what happens to her as she grows up? Do the sisters ever get together in life? Are you writing a sequel? Okay, so I'll just answer. I think several people in the audience and some of you know that I actually did finish a second novel 3 years ago that hasn't been sold. So that's, set in Malaysia. It's not it's a sequel to Evening is the Whole Day. There isn't going to be a sequel. There's not going to be other books about Uma or Asha. It revisits some of the same themes and some of the same political events, but it's a completely different novel otherwise. And I'm also, if that ever gets published, I don't know, but at the moment I'm also working on, I guess, a third novel that is about two sisters, because I think that sibling relationships are something that are going to emerge a lot in my work. At the time that I was writing Evening is the Whole Day, I had not had children, but now I am a mother of two daughters. So watching two sisters and, sort of raising two sisters in my house has made me think about sister relationships in particular. So I think in that sense, you hopefully will see more of that in my work, but not those exact two sisters in particular. And then I'll just quickly, what about the novel form appeals to you? Well, I do also write short fiction, and I love that for itself, but the novel form, and I think many people would say the same thing, it appeals to me in its expansiveness and its sort of infinite flexibility. It can contain as much or as little as you want, and there's no, the short story presents its own very invigorating challenges, which I enjoy also, but I like sort of the looseness of the novel and how it doesn't seem to, you need to have some awareness of, what to take out, what's too much, what's superfluous, but it's in some ways a much more forgiving form, and allows you to sort of create a whole world in a more leisurely way than a short story does. And that's what I enjoy about it. Okay, over to you, Sugi, for for that question.
So that is an interesting question. I am finishing a second novel, which I recently turned in, and so we will see what happens to that. And what appeals to me about the novel form, I think you put it very well. I had a teacher, I'm trying to remember who said this to me, who was talking about just sort of the way that like any great novel has a moment when it is just sort of excessive. It's just too much. And that's what the form wants. It just wants you to go a little overboard. And I really like that. You know, it's looking a little too long, or it's a little nerdy, or it digresses in a way that a short story wouldn't allow for. I think the short story rewards a certain kind of economy often. Not all, but many. And I think a lot of the novels that I love, as I was talking about before, break certain kinds of rules or are given to bagginess. Maybe that's a less kind way to say expansiveness. And I think that that's what I like about novels. And I was a reader of novels before I was a reader of short stories. So they're also just sort of, as a reader, my first love. And I think as a writer, Tania, you were saying that we write, of course, first to entertain ourselves. And I am most entertained, was first and most entertained, I think, by novels. So that's why I think I love writing them. Although certainly it is sometimes the 2-month thing sounds great though, Sonia. I think I also have had a decade plus stint of working on one, and that is really something. So there are other questions here, which I will try in sort of academic panel fashion to answer in omnibus form. I talked a little bit about speaking Tamil, and one of the questions observes that I have some Thirukkural quotes at the beginning of certain sections of my book. The Thirukkural was probably one of the first Tamil texts I read, and I did read it in English because my father had given me a copy. And it's also the sort of thing that gets quoted. And it's interesting because it's in many ways, like it's a secular text, and its Tamilness is its quality that defines it, I think, more than any particular connection to religion. And yet it sort of is often the ending to the sentence, there's a proverb in Tamil, which I feel like I've heard so many Tamil parents say to their recalcitrant children. But I do think that sort of the form of the proverb probably in some ways influenced the book. So there are also some questions here about the narrator of my first novel. And the narrator of my first novel, Love Marriage, is named Yalini. And some of the questions here about kind of her role and how I came to that. So Yalini is a first person narration, but she's not actually very much like me. She's sort of purposefully tilted to be a little bit more naive than me as sort of a proxy for the reader, so that she's learning certain things about Sri Lankan politics. And as a result, I think I'm able to put in information in the book that I already know, but actually I think a fair number of, say, diasporic Tamil readers or diasporic Sri Lankan readers might not know or might contest in some way. So that is one reason to have a narration like that. And yeah, I think having a narrator who's naive like that, it was interesting because I think a lot of people who talk to me about the book sometimes assume that Yalini is me, but she's not. So I think that's fine. I think that I would be sort of curious to talk to someone who knows more about this than I do, and perhaps this would be one of you, sort of the tradition of first person narration in South Asia, because I find that when I get this question, it's actually more often from South Asian and particularly Sri Lankan readers who assume that I am Yalini. And I do think also that the presumption of autobiography is one that comes more to writers of color, particularly in Western countries. People assume that if you are writing about your community, that it could not be a product of your imagination. And so if you have a narrator who in any way resembles you in even the most basic sense, like age or gender or height or affection for certain kinds of, I don't know, whatever, you know, like people are very eager to draw that parallel. And I do think that's a pressure that some writers face and others don't. And I will briefly say there are questions about whether I will continue to write about ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka. I certainly will. And with that, I think that's all I'll say about that. No, I frequently write and speak about Sri Lankan politics. I'm very interested in it. And I think I'm lucky that I live in a time when it's possible to follow the news so closely through the wonders and horrors of the internet, which is now bringing us such a flurry of pleasant news. I wonder, I don't want to presume about anyone's time constraints on the panel. Would people like to take another question?
You know, I want to quickly answer about writing in first person or
Please.
being about whether, you know, it is based on oneself. My first novel, An Isolated Incident, which actually just came out, reissued and updated, revised in England. So please buy the green cover if you do read it. It is a political novel also, and it has, except that my grandfather, who was a refugee, asked me to write about the Kashmir conflict. He was from Srinagar, Kashmir. It is not based on my life at all. It's about a gang rape victim, and it is also about a young boy grown up. So it's about a Kashmiri girl, and it's about a Kashmiri boy brought up in diaspora. And he's very idealistic. He ends up in Afghanistan terrorist training camp. I was not going anywhere near there physically, so there was a lot of research stuff involved. But you know, when you know, I keep being asked who I am in that, which is interesting given how heavy. Thankfully, I'm neither one, no one in that novel. None of those things have happened to me. But yes, I had to obviously, what else do we rely on, whether to be in the skin of an elephant or to, you know, except for our imagination, whether it's animals, whether it's people who have gone through, I mean, that's what we as writers do. And to be asked if we're writing autofiction or if it's, you know, we might base things on our emotions. You know, I've had a very dreadful miscarriage. So I'm able to sometimes channel those emotions into other losses. But you know, the freedom to use your imagination and not have it be based on your own life experiences. Like I've been asked, oh, so when you were gang raped? No, I wasn't. And when all your family was murdered? No, we thought your family was murdered. No, they weren't, you know? So, you know, and I'd grown up a lot on IRA, watching IRA on the news, and the Tamil Tigers also. I grew up a lot listening to the history and listening to Sri Lanka and what was going on, and it comes up in Isolated Incident, and clearly not something that is specific to my life, but nevertheless, this question always confuses and bemuses me, because as writers, it should, I think, almost sometimes, unless we're writing memoir or essays, which I do write too, and those are very different, I almost think it should be automatically taken for granted that we're using our imagination predominantly when writing a novel, and we're not at least none of the work I've done so far has been based on my life per se. So this question is always interesting to me, where people automatically assume, like, you're, you know, one of the first questions agents for An Isolated Incident asked me was, so this is based on your life. Who are you? Did this happen to your family? And I was like, no, it wasn't. Maybe it's for marketing purposes. They think it might be easier to market it. Who knows?
We should all invent fantastic lives that are not ours and write fake memoirs. I think that we maybe need to wrap up. I wonder if anyone has any last remarks they want to offer, or I will thank our audience.
I think we can also, if we really want to, or if we feel, you know, that we want to, that we can also type answers to these questions, or I don't know if that's going to be an option that's available after the session is over, maybe not, but yeah, I mean, the session has gone quite a long time over time, so I think we should probably wrap up.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure about our possibilities of typing in that chat, but if anyone would like to try that. And I think that this will also be recorded on and available on YouTube later. So thank you so much to the Mysuru Literary Festival for having us, to the organizers for their hosting us, and of course to all of you who are still with us, who have gone the distance with us in discussing literature, our openings, and we wish you all the best with your reading and writing, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mysuru Literary Forum Charitable Trust and the literary community of Mysuru Book Clubs thanks you for attending the 4th Mysuru Literature Festival and the first virtual festival. I opened a book by Julia Donaldson. I opened a book and in I strode. Now nobody can find me. I've left my chair, my house, my road, my town and my world behind me. I'm wearing a cloak, I've slipped on the ring. I've swallowed the magic potion. I've fought with a dragon, dined with a king, and dived in a bottomless ocean. I finished my book and out I came. The cloak can no longer hide me. My chair and my house are just the same, but I have a book inside me. And now, at the virtual sessions of Mysuru Literature Festival, we got to meet the authors who made this magic happen. On behalf of the Mysuru Literary Forum Charitable Trust and the literary community of Mysuru Book Clubs, we give our deepest thanks to the writers from across the world who made this happen. Authors who were able to join us in the digital space and share their books and their writing with us. And for the past hour, we left our chairs, our houses, our roads and traveled to meet them in this virtual space. Thank you for the experience.